welcome everyone, and our panel today is on the FinTech boom in India, the challenges and the opportunities, and I think it's a very interesting time. If you're, anyone who has anything to do with FinTech in India, it's a very exciting time to be in India. The reason is, a year ago, the government undertook an exercise called demonetization of high-value currency, and what that really did, it acted as a catalyst for the FinTech industry in India. We've seen a boom over the last 1 year that has changed the way India today accesses finance and financial products. So we've come a long way in just a span of 1 year, in what other countries would have taken, say, 3 to 4 years to achieve. Let me start by giving you some statistics. If you look at just the FinTech software market in India, that as of 2015, according to reports, was about $1.2 billion and is expected to double in the next 3 years. And to give you a sense of the opportunity that India holds, we're a population of 1.3 billion people, the second largest country in terms of the smartphone and mobile phone penetration, a large underbanked population, so to speak, but we have 300 million unique bank accounts that were opened in the last couple of years under the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, and lastly, unique identification, that is Aadhaar, that is now going to be linked to all bank accounts to push on services onto people as well. So to discuss that and more, and what the FinTech industry is at in India, what are the opportunities and challenges, we have a very eminent panel. They've all been introduced to you, but let me just quickly tell you again. Debashis is from the government of West Bengal, the minister in charge of Information Technology, Additional Secretary. We also have Shiv, who is the Chief Technology Officer at State Bank of India, which is India's largest bank. We also have Rohit, who is a director on the board of Axis Bank, one of the largest private banks in India, also an advisor to many FinTech companies. And Vish, many of you might be aware, a veteran of the Silicon Valley, also a venture director at Clearstone Ventures. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here today. And I'll start by talking about that watershed moment that has been an inflection point for FinTech in India, which is demonetization. A lot has happened in the last 1 year. We've covered a long journey in the last 1 year. What is the opportunity you see now? What's next in terms of what FinTech holds in India? Just start with a brief round of your thoughts. Rohit, would you like to start?
Sure. So Ritu, thanks for that introduction. While payments have garnered a lot of attention, if you think about where the opportunities are going forward, I'd point to potentially 3. So unsecured lending in India is going to see, to my mind, a huge boom for reasons of financial inclusion, for reasons of just driving economic growth. Associated with that is the micro and small and medium enterprises space. If India is to grow and GDP is to grow at the rates that we aspire to, the MSME segment contributes roughly between 35 and 40% of GDP. And for them to grow, it's really important that credit freely flow into that space. That hasn't happened at the pace so far that it needs to. So to my mind, that's a second large opportunity. And finally, there is a huge opportunity, I think, for targeted financial products. As one example, small ticket insurance. So if you think about the future, building on what's happened in payment space, unsecured lending, the MSME space, again, for credit growth, and targeted products like small ticket insurance, I think, is where a lot of the action is going to be.
Debashis, would you like to comment on it from the government point of view, some of the initiatives that the government has undertaken to propel this?
Yeah, thank you, Ritu. You have covered most of the points, but for emphasis, I will repeat on the Aadhaar matter. 99% of the India's population, which is huge, 1.3 billion plus, have Aadhaar. That is, their biometric data is captured in the computer, in the central database. So how easy is it for everyone to connect to each other, to transfer funds, and to do anything that bankers have been doing? So I think that the single most important point which qualifies a huge amount of investment and interest in India is the 99% coverage of the biometrics, and it is already been exploited. For example, NPIC has already made that without anything, only by using a as a finger scanner and a mobile phone, person A can transfer funds to person B. And also the mobile penetration is increasing by the day to such an extent that we believe that with the financial inclusion under the Jan Dhan Yojana, which has already opened 230 million accounts in the last few years, we are going to cover everybody, and very soon, technically, the need of cards will not be there anymore.
I hope so. Shiv, you're working at one of the largest public sector banks in India. How has been the experience with you being a traditional bank?
I think it has been a big challenge, as well as it has created a large opportunities for bankers like us. Once we started on our transformation agenda around 3.5 years back, and that's where the fintechs were also emerging. And they were posing the challenges, and they have in turn helped us to transform much faster and more aggressive manner. So be it is a wallet or a digital banking. So where the public sector unit like us, who do not have a large marketing or advertising budgets, we have seen that in 14 months we have 12 million customers subscribed to the wallet offering. And we can see the minimum balance as well maintain 150 rupees as a per wallet, which is much higher than the commercial wallets available in the India. And the max ticket amount of the transaction going as high as 26,000 rupee to pay to make an insurance payment.
Right.
So definitely the P2P instruments are growing. And similarly, as the Mr. Secretary has said just now, the Aadhaar-based India technology stack has been helping us to evolve the much better P2P solutions, just like UPI. And our UPI volumes recently we have seen within a month, they used to normally grow 20 to 30%. They have grown 70%
Right.
in a single month, and it has helped us to build the interoperability among the various mobile apps, which were various mobile payment apps,
Yeah.
and now we are unifying all these mobile apps into a single payment platform.
Vish, if you could come in and give us a context here. You've heard all the panelists speak about how what the opportunities in fintech in India are. If you compare India with the rest of the world, where do we stand today?
So, well, first of all, just delighted to be here, and good to meet you, and good to meet all of you. In the whole fintech scene, we are seeing a seismic shift globally, and especially is the payment is the one that is the leading, and we were fortunate to be the early investor in PayPal. And so when we went to India, we said, well, since we know payment pretty well, so why don't we look for a payment company? So we invested in a payment company called BillDesk, and our colleagues from SBI, they came as a co-investor. So payment is still kind of leading the way, even though India has a pretty huge cash component, but payment is the one. But I think, as Rohit mentioned, other sectors are really following suit in India too, and India is going digital big time.
Yeah. All right. Recently the government also introduced the goods and services tax, which is a single taxation system for the entire country. How much of a game changer has that been for fintechs, would you say? I understand how traditional banks would stand to benefit from the data pool. What is the opportunity for fintechs now in India because
Absolutely, of this? Ritu, this is a game changer once again. Aadhaar 99% is one, and GST is another. For GST, you have to digitize all your payments right down the line, and therefore the whole economy is now digitalized automatically, virtually. And therefore a huge economy like India, if it is GSTized, which it is one of the rare countries in the world to have done so, and we therefore have an opportunity from the fintech angle, because your economy is 100% digitized, and therefore fintech companies will have a great way of advising tax matters, of making inferences in the life insurance, in making stock predictions, and most importantly, in making all the benefits of financial inclusion available to everybody, rich and poor.
Rohit, would you like to add how life has changed because of some of these initiatives that have been taken up by the government recently?
So Ritu, as was mentioned, just the fact that it will be digitized, of course, brings efficiency along with it, and no argument with that. But I think where the larger benefit will occur is that theoretically GST becomes a repository of a lot of transactional data. And if we are to move from secured lending, which was fixated on collateral, to unsecured lending, which is focused on data flows, then it's really important to be able to tap into a database that has integrity to it. And hypothetically, hopefully, GST will become part of that large pool of data that will allow fintechs to partner with banks to use data to provide credit in a more meaningful way.
All right. Vish, would you like to add to that?
Sorry, what was the question again?
So how GST has been a game changer for fintech in India. I mean, now you have this new whole data pool, so to say, of transactional data, tax data that fintechs could use to lend to people. Is that an area of opportunity you see growing phenomenally from here?
Oh, definitely. You know, the whole fintech space, know your customers is a big thing.
Yeah.
And with the GST, because now we should be able to collect more data, you know, there'll be hopefully more transparency. So that's really going to definitely pave the way, so you'll know the customers much better. And hopefully the customers will become more demanding for services too.
You know, I think what the audience would also be interested in is some of the areas of opportunity that are emerging for fintech, whether it's an investment or as a fintech. I know because of the goods and services tax, the government initiatives, there's a lot of scope for fintech software. What are the emerging industries, for instance, defense, media, telecom, where you see an opportunity for fintech companies to grow from here? Mr. Bhasin?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities, like some of the very first we have been working on issuing the personal loan on the debit card. Normally the personal loans on the credit card are there. So we have tied up with the e-commerce players like Flipkart and Amazon, where based on the person's debit card uses, we have been able to offer him the personal loan. And then similarly, we are working with these fintechs for the SME lending as well, where based on their capital assist platforms of these e-commerce players, we know their transactional details. And based on the cash flows, we have been able to give the loans as a loan market on the capital assist platform itself. So where the merchants are getting the loans at a cheaper rate than the rest of the market, and these kind of platforms are again booming up by the open architecture of the banking, which is like we are exposing the APIs, and that's where a lot of fintechs are emerging, which are providing the various alternate methods of the credit scoring systems, be it is a SME lending or a personal loans.
Yes.
So where earlier people used to depend on the manual books of the balance sheets, handwritten, and PSU sector banks used to refer to those to lend the SMEs and the large corporates. Now those are your bank statements and various alternate cash flow statements which are received from the e-commerce players or alternate electronic transactions. And in case of personal loans, the alternate data, the credit scorecards are being prepared based on the behavioral scoring, how the customer is using the keyboard of the smartphone, and or how various SMS transactions which are being occurring, or the social media platform. So these are some of the examples. There are many more other innovative ways of driving the person's behavioral trait to carry out his day-to-day transaction, returning the loan capabilities. So those are helping the banks to lend more and more.
Yeah.
And that's where the fintechs have the opportunity to come up with the newer applications which can fed to the credit scoring engine of the banks in more meaningful data.
I think we'll touch upon more on the relationship, the evolving relationship between banks and fintechs later, but there's a question from the audience on Aadhaar. It says, the Aadhaar stack in India is impressive to enable digital services. However, does data sharing with the private sector ensure data privacy and address cyber concerns? Mr. Sen, would you like to take that?
Yes, that is a very, very important question. We value the right to privacy, and we are very clear in our minds that the person's name and identity shall not and will not be divulged under any circumstances. There is right now a court case going on in the Supreme Court of India, and it is not very wise right now to discuss in very detail, but there has to be a golden strike in between availability of mass data in an anonymous fashion and use of the data protecting the privacy of the person. I think we have to draw a golden line, and therein lies the main opportunity. But if I may, Ritu, I would add another point about the fintech opportunity, what he was saying just now, is another point that we need to discuss about is the democratic dividend, that 70% of India's population is below 32. So their rate of adoption of fintech technology, statistics says, is 52% for the digitally active persons, and we are only second to China at the moment. So therefore, I think we have a great place because most people in India already are into digital technology.
Rohit, you're also working with on the board of a large private sector bank. Trust is integral to onboarding customers, especially when you're a fintech and not a traditional bank. How do you ensure safety of this data, this large mass data? When you talk about KYC and onboarding customers using Aadhaar, how do you ensure privacy and safety of this data?
So Ritu, that's obviously a complicated and really important issue. You were talking about the India stack, and right at the top of the stack, of course, is the consent layer. And the consent layer, I think, goes a long way towards starting to build that trust, because now, instead of your physical documents being shared all over the place, you can actually have token-based consent. So it's virtual consent, and the safeguards around that are much higher. So that's an answer from a technical perspective. But we all know that when you have a relationship with a financial institution, there's an emotional element to it. So banks and financial institutions are going to need to go out of their way in terms of the messaging that they put out to emphasize the importance they place on this issue. And while you can't, to the average person, talk about the technical solutions you're putting in place, I think you have to repeatedly emphasize the importance of privacy and the emphasis that your particular organization is placing on it. So a combination of the stack as well as the particular importance an organization puts on it will start to make headway in that direction. It's a long journey though.
A long journey indeed. There's one more question from the audience on Aadhaar. It says, will we see Aadhaar be used by entities outside India? I mean, I think the answer is a no, but if the panelists have any point to make, Vish?
I don't think so.
Yeah, no, I don't. It's like the social security number you'd have in the US. I don't think it's relevant only to your country in the services that you will be receiving from the government. But, back to our discussion here, and we were talking about the relationship between traditional banks and fintechs now evolving. Compared to other countries like China, for instance, where there are thousands of fintechs, we have a handful of, 40 to 50 in the payment space, which is largely, when you talk about, fintechs in India, it's dominated by payments so far. How do you see that relationship evolving? For instance, outside, what has been the experience? In the end, I mean, will consolidation have to be the answer? Will all of them survive this? Or will there be more and more collaboration with traditional banks going forward? Is that the business model that will have to be adopted?
Well, the collaboration with the banks and the regulators is going to be key. That's always going to be happening. So while the innovation is going to come from the private sectors, in our example, BillDesk. We funded BillDesk, but the partnership came from State Bank of India and all that, and they partner with all the top billers, all the top banks, And that's the model that's going to be continuing everywhere, because while the innovation being driven by the young startups and the new players, but the old players are super important in this space.
Rohit, I mean, as a banker, if you were to say, would you rather partner? Do you see them as a threat, or do you see them as a partner?
So, Ritu, with your permission, can I just sort of step back and answer this question about how markets have evolved, because I think it
Sure.
leads to an answer to the question that you're posing. So if you compare and contrast just for a moment the way the US has evolved versus, let's say, how China has evolved, and see if there are any lessons from that in terms of where India is headed. So in the US, I'm an advisor to a fintech unicorn called SoFi. There are other firms like Lending Club, Wealthfront, Betterment that have sort of on their own achieved a fair amount of scale. And US banks have been relatively slow. There are relationships, for example, between JP Morgan and On Deck Capital, so it started. But they've been relatively slow in forming those collaborations. Now, if you look at what's happened in China, although the Chinese banks perhaps moved even more slowly, the digital intermediaries, the Tencents, the Alibabas, Alipays, Ant Financials, etc., saw the opportunity, stepped in, and created their own, and it's a much cliched term, but created their own ecosystems. So where I hope India will go, and this is where I'm going to now try to answer the direct question that you asked me, is that I hope that the banks will be more progressive, and they'll realize that, in fact, feeling threatened by the fintechs doesn't really make long-term sense. And that the way a bank should think about itself in the future is more as a platform for data-enabled services and products. Using APIs, they should open up the platform to best-of-breed partners and really create a combination of capabilities and services that make it pointless for a consumer to think about going somewhere else. 'Cause
Right.
the idea of a walled garden, I think, is beyond its shelf life now.
I mean, if you talk about banks, it's nothing that the fintechs are doing that the traditional banks cannot do, except that it requires that much more investment in technology and in, finance, of course. Vish, can you take us through some of the experience in other countries, like Rohit was talking about in the US and China, how the relationship has evolved? Like I was asking you earlier, how the business models, will they need to change? Because, we know it's a cash-bleeding business. Customer is king, margins are wafer thin. So how is that evolved in other countries, a lesson perhaps for India?
Well, India's evolution is definitely, it had to follow suit to what's happening in the US and what's happening in China. And China is well ahead of India right now. But I think with India, things are, India is number 2 in terms of population, and it's going to grow. Number 2 in terms of mobile penetration. Number 2 again in the internet penetration. Number 2 again in the smartphone penetration. Yeah. So these things are happening. And I think the Indian consumer is becoming more and more demanding from what we see right now. You guys are bankers and you can see it. So I see India just evolving, and also a lot of venture capital is going to go and fund some newer innovation. So while Rohit is saying, the banks, they have to be progressive, they have to evolve. And like I see the State Bank of India, ICICI Bank, all the banks are really catching up quite a bit. But I think the other issue is that which had to do with security, because as these things become more digital, there is still a lot of fear in Indian people's mind. Cash is safe, even though they know it's not safe, people can steal, but there's this fear. So security had to be also addressed in a big way. I see it.
Right, you're also the money man, so let me ask you this. The funding also, if you look at the trends in India, most of it has been towards payments, hasn't it been?
Most of the
investments, the big ticket investments have been in the payment space, if you talk about fintech in India. What are the other areas of opportunities, like Rohit was talking about lending? If you could take us through the funding, how the trend has been.
Yeah, so again, in the fintech space, of course, the payment is a big one. This mobile banking, has already come on the scene. Like Paytm is more like a, wallet, mobile wallet kind of stuff. The insurance products are coming up. We looked at several. We didn't invest because we didn't feel they really were, those companies could scale. pretty well because the insurance concept in India is relatively new. It's not as common as in the US, for example, right? Or China, insurance is not there. Health, related insurance, again, so these are, but I think the payment tools and maybe and the lending are the two key areas I would say will get lion's share of the growth. Yeah.
There's, again, a few more questions from the audience. I think, Mr. Sen, you could answer this one. Much was said about demonetization over the last 1 year or so. Has there been a real change on the ground in India? Are people really using more e-payments?
Absolutely. The number of ATMs, that is anytime money that we all use, has actually gone down in the last few months or years. I forget, I think in the last year. The number of ATMs have gone down. People are not withdrawing money because the whole thing, people have got used to the digital framework, and as we are continuously trying to say, this is good for the Indian economy, digitization on cashless economy. It is formal, it is easy to analyze, it is easy to control, and it is the way to prosper.
Right.
Why so? Because another thing which Rohit just mentioned, know your customers and other things, e-tokens, these are all coming out of the disruptive technologies like blockchain. And within this framework, if you want to work, you have to have a digitized economy. This is a great benefit to you and me, to government and citizen.
Shiv, if you could speak for, SBI is 1/4 of the banking system. So if you could speak for the industry in India per se, how many of the customers are really moving away from traditional cash handling and moving on to the electronic payments, for instance, even in your bank? What is basically?
Yeah, actually, a lot of transactions have moved to the digital now, but still, when we look at it, the overall transaction profile of the bank, we have 76% of our transaction volumes going through the e-payment gateways as well as from internet, mobile.
70%.
76%.
76%.
So,
okay.
and the ATM channels.
Okay.
So ATM is included in this.
Right.
So all these channels put together, 76% of transaction volumes are going through these channels. And when we talk about the demonetization, so if there was a growth of 20% on an average per month, during the demonetization it jumped to 80%.
Yeah.
But later on, once the cash availability became normal, so that's where it came down. But earlier the growth used to be 20, as I said. Now the growth is running month over month, 35 to 40%. So normal, it has gone up, but it has not just like 70 to 80%. It has
so
come
I think
down
initially after demonetization, there was a huge spike.
Right.
But now that has petered down and it's settled down. But still, if you look at the latest data, which the Reserve Bank of India puts out, I think the average number of electronic transactions per month has gone up by about 200 million compared to pre-demonetization days. So there has been a jump, yes. But that pace of, initial jump that we saw has not been maintained, so to say. There's another question, interestingly, on the payments bank, and I wanted to bring this up with the panelists. One of the government's and the regulators' attempt to bring access to finance to the last mile was licensing of payment banks, which is again based on technology. 11 payment bank licenses were given out. Very few have started. You're one of the people who's tied up with Reliance to set up a payments bank in India. Now the question is, has the concept really taken off here?
I think, banks have really, been, frightened. I think frightening is good in this kind of environment, and they have transformed themselves, so much that payments banks probably are now finding the space whether they will be able to survive in the market or not. And reason is why, because I will go back to some of the previous questions, link this. So right now in the market, we have 300 million plus smartphone users in India. And then when we talk about the Aadhaar and security we were talking about, so apart from the data privacy and all which is taking place, we are, as per Aadhaar Act, most of the banks are putting the security infrastructure much more advanced than even the card history, like more than the PCI DSS compliance kind of a thing, where the Aadhaar will be completely secured and all the alternate IDs will be used within the across systems and all. Now, looking at all these two infrastructures in place, we have come up with a various, SBI is launching a digital bank, which will be the first digital bank.
Which is a traditional bank's attempts to tap, the new age customer, be more digital, tech savvy.
Right.
But what about the payments bank? Why is it that we haven't seen a lot of them come up so far in the last 1 year since the licenses were given out?
See, some of the things have been that they are not allowed to have other than the CASAs. So, and few payments. And now in the payment industry as well, the banks we have 150 APIs and we are moving them based on the open bank API architecture. So the banks themselves are now coming forward and partnering with the various FinTechs. And so payment banks and UPI specifically has made that irrelevant, which is interoperability actually.
Vish, could you comment on that? Do you think the Unified Payments Interface or the UPI, which has now been brought in by NPCI, will that make the whole concept of payment banks redundant now?
Oh, I don't think so.
You think there's still scope for payment banks to, tap that last mile, the very last mile customers? Is that something that you think will still take off in India?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to predict. Maybe Rohit can comment on that one.
Rohit is a private banker. I'm sure he wants to.
So by virtue of being a private banker, I have
Wouldn't
an opinion on
want the
everything.
payment banks really to take up your market share, would you?
I want to chip in. See, today around 60 to 70% of the banking is with the PSU banks.
Yeah.
And one of the friction factor in the payment industry was the P2P payments which UPI is resolving.
Yeah.
As well as there are alternate cross-sell, upsell products. Like whenever you are having financial services needs, you are buying your insurance products, cards, and other investment instruments. Those were not digitally available. And some of the private sector banks have them hosted on the internet banking, or they have cross-linking their group sites and all. But now the PSU sector banks like SBI is coming up with a single platform. You can buy the all these cross-sell, upsell products from there, like insurance, life insurance, as well as the cards and the investment banking products from the same platform. And that's where the payment bank had this opportunity that they will make money or commissions from this cross-sell, upsell.
Yeah.
And which is also getting, slimmed down when the banks are more digitizing their business processes and making it, seamless for the customers.
Sorry, Rohit, did you want to add something? I wanted to move on to the very issue because of which payments bank was brought in, and that is access to finance. But before that, if you had any comments, I'd quickly take those.
So, Ritu, it's a very simple proposition. I think payment banks are great in that they've spurred competition and they've forced traditional banks to improve their act.
Yeah.
But if you look at their economic model, it's going to be extremely challenged. I mean, the economic models of all banks are going to be challenged, and they're going to have to get used to a world where you're moving from low volume, high value, high cost transactions to a world of high volume, low value, and low cost.
Yeah.
And in that context, if you're a one-trick pony, you're going to find it very difficult to survive.
Yeah, which is why I think we've seen 3 to 4 players already withdraw, from the licenses that they had received from the Reserve Bank.
And interoperability will only worsen the situation.
Yeah, we'll get to those new guidelines in just a bit. But as I was talking, access to finance remains a big challenge in India. Most of the connectivity with respect to data that we see right now is in urban India, and that is only part of the population. There's still a huge untapped opportunity if you look at the rural areas. What has been the experience again, Vish, if you could tell us, in the more advanced countries, for instance, a state like Andhra Pradesh is using electricity poles to bring data to the last mile. Should we look at more satellite broadband kind of connectivity? Because, it is capital intensive to set up mobile towers to bring data to the last mile.
Well, so, India already has announced, lots of initiatives to provide connectivity in the notion of, the digital India. That's what they're talking about. But that requires a lot of capital. So the issue for India is, where is all this capital going to come from? Because the government is announcing all these all the programs, but the foreign capital had to really, if you take a look at even the startup scene in India, all the money basically came from foreign investors.
Yeah.
We went to India, so USA investing a lot, then Asians have moved in. Now even Singapore, is moving in. The Indian capital is like only 5% for startup companies, and the infrastructure, investment. That's why Prime Minister Modi has become one of the most terrific salesmen, trying to court all the foreign countries to bring investments. And I know Masa is announcing big investment. Jack Ma is moving in. So I think, and then Google announced plans, Microsoft announced plans, Facebook announced plans. I mean, everyone, really trying to, but they also have to figure out how they get the money back.
Can I just add to your question? Is that what would be the great strategy to connect the great rural hinterland of India? And I think one of the best strategies is, when we think a few years back, everybody didn't have STDs and phones. So one went to a PCO office, paid 2 rupees and talk to London. So the equivalent that is now being talked about in TRAI, that is Telecom Regulations Authority of India, is that have Wi-Fi towers. Have Wi-Fi towers, you go to a central place in the village and you pay a small amount and get the connectivity instead of room to room.
I think that's what many of the banks have adopted several villages across India and tried to make them cashless in the last 1 year. So that is the attempt there. But if you could also apprise our audience of some of the government initiatives, talk about Digital India or BharatNet, which aims to connect all the, about 2.5 lakh villages with data. How far has that progressed? Because wherever there is a challenge, there's also an opportunity for many others to come in and better that.
Absolutely. The huge hinterland, that is the rural India, is already progressing in leaps and bounds. And they are having the first taste of the digital finance, the FinTech. And if you give them the first blood, this is where victory is. Examples in African countries say that even in places like Togo, where there was no copper connectivity, they've gone to the mobile revolution, and M-Pesa of Vodafone is really almost the parallel currency there. So what we need to do here is to look at technologies that allow digital transactions just if you have a connectivity. The UPI initiative is a great thing. That is why I think the e-banks are not operating too well. But if every person, if there is DBT, direct benefit transfers, to everybody's mobile phone, wouldn't that be great for a 1.3 billion people? I think the stress rightly being given by the government is either by Wi-Fi hotspots or by extending the telecom coverage. We are going to cover every bit of India. Every citizen of India may not be every square feet of India.
Rohit, what more would you like to see from the government to, improve the digital infrastructure of the company? I mean, you've worked with fintechs across the world. Share some examples with us that India could emulate, for instance. We have someone from the government right here. Perhaps we'll get our voice heard.
So are you asking me to share examples of what governments elsewhere have done?
What could work for India, given the current ecosystem?
Ritu, as a general policy matter, right, we are living in a world where connectivity is a utility now, right? And so while it's all well and good for us to say that banks should sponsor villages, etc., I think it's really important that our policymakers develop an agenda where they consider providing connectivity to be a general social good. Now, how that's funded is beyond my pay grade, but in general, from at least one person's perspective, I think that's an incredibly important thing to do. Now, elsewhere, individual companies like Google, etc., have driven projects that have tried to bring connectivity in remote places through all sorts of fancy technology. I'm not sure that we need to get that far out on the imagination curve. Even if we do some relatively basic things and bring connectivity to the last mile. I began my comments by saying that there's a huge opportunity in unsecured lending in personal space. Well, that's going to be the backbone on which that business is going to be built.
All right.
Can I briefly touch upon the USO, just for Rohit's information? The universal service obligation, when you pay for your mobile phone in Airtel or Vodafone, part of it is being used through the license fee cross-subsidization for extending coverage in the rural areas. You are aware of that?
Excellent.
There's another question from the audience. I think Rohit or Shiv, one of you could take this. How can the NPCI and NET's collaboration and cooperation help SMEs in India? Anyone from the panel who would like to take that?
I think, see, there is what my personal opinion is, I think NPCI can definitely help, but beyond NPCI also we need to think that there, some of the large financial conglomerate like ourselves, we need to come up with a alternate lending methodologies, as we are working with the alternate, building a alternate lending solutions, be it is, as I discussed earlier with you, not looking at the books, but really looking at some of the electronic transaction profilings or the alternate credit scoring engines, and then writing the credit solutions or lending solutions on that. So we are working with some of the various fintechs, called Credit Vidya, Credit Mantri, as well as various PFM solutions, be it is a Yardley or Perfios, where the alternate lending solutions for SME and personal loan segments we are working with. So they have to be very, very, we have to build these large banks, those kind of leaner methods or leaner credit appraisal processes, which can have a lending provided at a short span of a time with a frictionless way. And NPCI having a payments data, they are sitting on the mine of the data, but I think probably their hands are too full to handle the scalability of the payments needs actually.
Sorry, jumping topics here, but we have the last few minutes. Vish, quickly, we spoke about the regulatory environment briefly when Rohit mentioned the prepaid payment instrument guidelines. Leave that aside, as an investor when you come to India, if you look at the fintech space, if you look at it from the regulatory angle, how easy or difficult is it to do business in India?
Well, it's a known fact, India has been one of the, not the easiest country to do business with. India's, ranking, while it has improved now dramatically this year, but India still has ways to go. And I think, and more confidence, I think, the current government is definitely giving more confidence to the foreign investors. That my money is safe, I can invest and I can also take money out. So those reforms, the regulatory reforms have to come in, and India really needs. India does not have shortage of talent. A lot of brain power, people are very creative, very bright, but India just needs capital. India needs investment, and unless you make the investment, it is very hard, for India to really accomplish all these ambitions. And India has so many other, competing investment challenges that India needs to, grow its economy. So that's how I just see, and now every state, I left India 50 years ago, I live in the US, but every state I've seen it progressively, every state comes and they're trying to sell their state to the US pretty well, they're selling to other countries, and things are getting better. Things are definitely getting better, no doubt, but the youth, the other thing I wanted to say about the India, I think the youth is putting a lot more pressure in India to really drive the reforms in India, because they are the hope, they are the future. And I think, India definitely will emerge, but,
Rohit, from your experience, how easy or difficult has it been to be a fintech in India right now?
Ritu, I don't work for the government, I don't work for a regulator, so I have no reason to say what I'm about to say.
Okay.
I'll say that in the area of financial regulation, I think India has been fairly progressive recently. And I'll give you a quick compare and contrast. In the US, there are continued pitched battles between state regulators and national regulators around things as simple as providing a banking license. Yeah. Whereas in India, at least more recently, between the Jam Trinity, between the India stack, all right, there have been execution issues with demonetization and GST, but they're all moves in the right direction. So I think between the policymakers and the regulators, while there's obviously more to be done, we should give a nod to the fact that they are trying to, relative to their global counterparts,
yeah, in fact,
be progressive.
Banking licenses have been made on tap. We've licensed payment banks, so you license small finance banks. I mean, the number of licenses we've given out in the last few years is more than collectively what we would have opened in the last decade or so. But, you know, quickly again, Shiv, there's one more question from the audience on robo-advisory. That's one area in India. Do you see that market growing? And if yes, are there any regulatory concerns on robo-advisory?
I think there are not, we used to think, or a lot of, people are hiding behind the regulatory concerns. Rather, robo-advisory is something similar like personal finance management. And that's where even the RBI is promoting, that go for the, aggregators in the personal finance management. So this used to be earlier the concern of a lot of PSU banks that we cannot source the data or mine the data using screen scraping technology or something like that, with a consent of the customer from the other banks, digital channels. But that is RBI themselves are promoting. Similarly, on the robo-advisory side, I have not seen any regulatory concerns per se. And even SBI is investing into its digital platform, which will be, the next phase of the digital platform, which will be rolling out over a 6-month period. We are working with some of the robo-advisor solutions.
Okay, great. So we're just left with a few minutes now, and I have 2 questions for all of the panelists, starting with you, Debashis. What do you see as areas in which India is ahead of the rest of the world in FinTech? What are the areas in which India could emulate some of the examples from the outside world? If you could quickly give us your comments on that.
Okay.
Or where we've been trendsetters, for instance. You can share those as well.
Very briefly, you see the world is moving towards ICOs and blockchain. ICO, the latest issue of Economist magazine, says that it has mobilized $3.2 billion in last year alone. This is where we are moving to, the world is moving to, and the FinTech community in Singapore that we are sitting today must realize that ICOs are a huge money spinners. And India is not sitting alone. Its centers in Kolkata, in Vizag, and in Maharashtra are coming up in FinTech, blockchain, and cryptocurrencies, and we are preparing to again lead the world through multidisciplinary approach of statisticians, mathematicians, IT professionals, and economists to catch this FinTech market. So ICO is the single word that we keep to prepare for.
ICO from him. Shiv, quickly, one area where India can learn from the others where it's lagging behind in FinTech, and one area where India is a trendsetter for the rest of the world.
I think we are the trendsetter in the payments area, given the India stack, and we are leading the world, quite ahead. A lot of European and even US has to catch up with us. And in terms of the lending solution, I think we have to catch up with the rest of the world where we have to remove the friction.
Rohit?
So, Ritu, you would be surprised as to how many people, even in developed markets, are unbanked. And the reason for that is that the cost models there are tuned to relatively more affluent portions of society. So an area where India can take the lead is to show how low-cost models that are focused on financial inclusion can actually be used for the unbanked in developed markets. Okay. And I would have a somewhat contrary opinion on this whole issue of ICOs. If I may, one place we can learn is to prevent some of the irregularities that have crept into the ICO world with all sorts of nonsensical stuff that's happening outside, and just make sure that our progress
learn from their mistakes.
Learn from their mistakes, and our progress is appropriately regulated, because there's been a lot of fraudulent activity.
But you're not arguing against, I hope?
Not against them, but against appropriately managed ICOs.
Vish, quick comments? Where India is a trendsetter and where it's lagging behind and it can learn?
I think both Rohit and Shiv, they said it pretty well. Payment and, these unbanked, micro lending, small lending, I think that's a huge opportunity over there for people in India.
Okay, last question, very last question. The FinTech market is predicted to be a $45 billion industry by 2020. What role do you see India playing? Just a few words.
In the FinTech space?
Yes.
I think India, as I said, the technology is already there for FinTech. But I think India just, if they can really find more suitable applications of this technology,
Okay.
better applications for, of
Right.
the technology, because I don't think India can develop technology. It's all been developed, FinTech, yeah.
Okay, $45 billion market, what role will India play?
So as I said earlier, I think there's a tremendous amount of innovation that can be
Like-
done here
Yeah.
that can then actually play across national borders to be applied not only to other developing markets,
Yeah.
but also to the developed world.
Shiv?
Yeah, I think India has got tremendous talent, and I disagree with you earlier that we have fewer fintechs. I think we have a lot of fintechs, as well as I think the Indian fintechs are going outside, in Europe as well and US. So I believe that we will have catching up roughly, I think 10 times of what we know the value today actually.
All right, Debashis, last comments from you.
Well, for FinTech, India would be among the top 2 countries, I have no doubt. So please join us if you want to be the first.
All right, with that, it's a wrap on this session. Very optimistic here, some pessimism there, but overall, I mean, there's a lot of challenges, but that creates an equal number of opportunities in a big country like India. So thank you, all of you, very much for joining us today, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing your thoughts. Thank you.